It's a pleasure and privilege for me to address this illustrious conference on justice for Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Now, as co-president of JJAC and a refugee, son of refugees, this issue is very close to my heart. To finally see that this issue is being discussed in the highest echelons of the Israeli government and in the media worldwide brings a sense of relief and recognition, not only to me, but also to millions of Jewish refugees and their descendants, that the wheels of justice are beginning to turn. First and foremost, I would like to take this opportunity to thank my dear friend, Deputy Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon, for his steadfast support and leadership on this issue. From the moment we brought this matter to his attention a few years ago, he immediately took it upon himself to bring it to a level of high importance in the Israeli government and in the international arena. It is his dedication that made this conference a reality. I would also like to thank the World Jewish Congress for stepping in and making the issue for justice for Jews from Arab countries a major point in their worldwide agenda. Their defense of Jewish causes during all of the decades of their existence is essential and irreplaceable. I would like to recognize and thank my colleagues, members of JJAC, for all the years of dedication, hard work, and hope against all odds, bringing the attention of the world to the issue of justice for Jews from Arab countries. My friends, we are finally here. I would be remiss if I did not mention the efforts and hard work of member of Knesset, Rabbi Nissim Ze'ev, who as a pioneer fought against all odds and strong opposition from his own coalition government here in Israel to bring the issue of justice for Jews from Arab countries to the floor of the Knesset and pass a law to recognize the predicament and compel the government of Israel to seek justice for Jews from Arab countries. And of course, a debt of gratitude to Congressman Gerald Nadler, my fellow New Yorker, for his effort in passing a congressional resolution and for his renewed effort in now trying to pass a law that will compel also the US government in favor of the justice for Jews from Arab countries. Ladies and gentlemen, a major obstacle to the elusive peace in the Middle East is the issue of the Arab-Palestinian refugee problem. Yet, a key component to understanding this problem has been overlooked, ignored, and obscured in the current dialogue. That is until today, hopefully. This component is the history of human rights violations, persecution, and ethnic cleansing of the Jews from Arab countries. These Jews from Arab lands and their descendants compose roughly 50% of the population of Israel. How did these Jews come to live in all of these Arab countries? Jews constituted a stable and historic community in these countries dating back at least 3,000 years, centuries and millennia before Muhammad and Islam. The Aleppo Syrian community dates back to King David 3,000 years ago. The Yemenite community to King Solomon 2,900 years ago. The Iraqi and Iranian community date back to the first Babylonian exile 2,500 years ago. And the Egyptian community, if you count from the time of Moses, is over 3,000 years ago too. To be able, however, to understand what happened to the Jewish community of Arab countries, we need to understand the historical background. Since the time of Muhammad and the Islamic conquest in 622 of the North African tribes and the Iberian Peninsula, the legal status of Jews in Arab lands has been based on the Quran, which sets forth the law governing both the religious and secular lives of the Muslims. Jews were known as believers, and as such were not given the choice to either adopt Islam or die, although in certain areas that was the case. Instead, they were given a third choice of submission. Therefore, coexistence between Jews and Muslims required the Jews to be submissive to the Muslims. Jews were given protection from death and conversion as the dhimmis. This protection required that the dhimmis pay a poll tax known as jizya or fine. The dhimmis were discriminated against in many areas of life including religious, commercial, educational, and social status. This codified discrimination against dhimmis made them scapegoats and vulnerable to mob action, assault, rape, torture, and humiliation by their Muslim hosts. Additionally, discriminatory clothing regulations were applied to Jews in most parts of the Muslim world. The invention of the yellow star was not a Nazi one, exposing them to public abuse from all quarters. Thus, the relative tolerance of the Islamic world in medieval times was replaced by profound contempt. As the 20th century began with World War I and then World War II, the Jewish communities in North Africa and the Middle East went through significant changes, including torture, imprisonment, ghettoization, alienation, and murder. As World War II ended and the terrible toll of destruction of the Jews became apparent, the 1 million Sephardic Jews of the Islamic world survived the war, although they were quite shaken by the years of persecution, torture, and assault. Within only a few years, their ancient communities would be abruptly and totally uprooted. When martial law was eased in 1947, anti-Jewish violence exploded, reaching crisis proportions. This happened when the United Nations voted to partition mandatory Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Jews in Arab lands became the target of the frustrated Arab mobs. Official discrimination, persecution, expulsion took place, leading the Jewish communities to flee for their lives in many places with only the clothes that they were wearing and leaving everything behind. Today, for all intent and purposes, Jewish life in Muslim lands has ended. My personal and parents' story begin in Aleppo, Syria. Jews have been living in Aleppo for thousands of years, as I mentioned earlier. The Jewish community in Syria formed a central link in the unbroken chain of Jewish settlements throughout the Fertile Crescent, which stretched from ancient Israel to Babylonia. The Syrian Arab nationalist movement brought the Arab-Israeli conflict to the attention of the public in Syria. Soon after the United Nations resolution in 1947 in favor of a Jewish state, anti-Jewish riots broke out in Aleppo. Synagogues were set afire, Jewish shops and houses were pillaged, and thousands of Aleppo's Jews were forced to flee the country. The refugees reached Lebanon and Turkey, and from there to other countries of the world, including the United States and, of course, Israel. Less than 4,000 Jews remained in Aleppo in the 1950s from the original 18,000 in the early 1940s. It is believed that during the synagogue burnings on the 8th of Kislev, corresponding to December 1st, 1947, the Arab rioters entered the great synagogue. They broke open the safe thinking that it had money, but they found the famous Aleppo Codex, the most ancient authoritative copy of the Bible, and damaged part of it. Under the persistent repression of the authorities from 1947 to 1990s, many members of the Jewish community sustained the risk in order to escape the persecution. Many attempts at escaping ended in tragedies, with innocent Jews being tortured and murdered. Today, Syria has less than 50 Jews living in the country. A Jewish community that originated over 3,000 years before any Islam, any Arab nationality existed, is no more. My own parents fled for their lives once the mobs, aided by the police they had once trusted, began burning synagogues and Sifrei Torot in what became known as the Haraya. On that day, Syrian rioters entered the building in which my parents lived, which was right next to the synagogue. In minutes, my mother heard screams from people in the neighborhood. They are beating the Jews, destroying their property, looting stores, ruining businesses, and in this way, altering the course of the Sephardic Jewish community of Aleppo forever. Escape was risky, as the gates were shut down and Syrian police patrolled the border, keeping Jews as prisoners. Those that dared to try and bribe a well-connected official or walk outside the border where no one would see them were mostly unsuccessful. Instead, They were being killed, tortured, or arrested in the process. My own parents hid in my grandparents' house, further away from the synagogue. Then, a few days later, they made separate attempts to try and escape. My mother obtained a doctor's permit and took my older brothers to the Lebanese mountains. The air was cleaner and a promise of a healthier life awaited them, since one of my brothers was ill for over 1 year. My father's escape took a different path, however. He tried to smuggle himself out of the country and was caught several times. He never gave up the quest to join his family, however, and his last attempt found God on his side. Just when he thought he was unsuccessful yet again and was caught in the streets of Aleppo, he immediately realized he was actually caught by a Syrian guard he happened to know, who surreptitiously warned him of his impending arrest. He said, "Look, you are being pursued by the authorities because you have tried to escape a few times, and I have orders to arrest you. I am coming back to arrest you tomorrow." My father did not need any stronger of a hint. With the help of some friends, he boarded the train to Lebanon that same night and enlisted the help of a train official with whom he was acquainted. The man hid him in the cargo load and told him he could not breathe, sneeze, or move any muscle, or else they would both be caught and killed. My father hid that way for hours, his fear intensifying once the train reached the border. Police searched the cargo load very well, and when they got to his wagon, he was certain he would be discovered. But luckily, the officer who was searching got distracted and moved on to another wagon. He was saved miraculously, but knew he could not remain idle. As soon as they reached the border, my father jumped off of the moving train and onto a ravine. Amazingly, aside from a few bruises, he was unscathed and began to walk through the rough Lebanese terrain in search of his family. He traveled by night so as not to be seen and eventually reunited with his wife, my mother, and his children, my older siblings. They all received the shock of their lives since they had no idea he was coming. He left everything behind: home, furniture, business, clothing, and property. All he had left in the world was a small bag and the clothes on his back. It was the creativity of my mother and the courage of my father that ultimately brought them to relative safety in Lebanon. Had my father been caught, I would not have been standing here today to tell you this story. I would not have been born. Though Lebanon was relatively peaceful, our status always remained as refugees. Even though most of my siblings, including myself, were born in Lebanon, we could never leave the country because no other country wanted to receive us. We were refugees. We could not move about the country without refugee identity cards. Yes, we were allowed to live in the country, but not as free citizens. During the next 22 years in Lebanon, living as Jewish refugees, we lived through the 1956 Sinai campaign, the 1958 Lebanese Civil War, and the 1967 Six-Day War. We endured discrimination, fear of persecution, and hid our identity most of the time. We did not speak about Israel. We did not speak about being Jews. After Black September and the transferring of the PLO leadership to Lebanon in 1969, the Jewish community felt threatened and began to flee Lebanon. One day, a poster-sized picture was plastered on many mosques all over Lebanon. The picture was of the three rabbinical leaders, which included my father, all dressed in the rabbinical garbs and robes with their talit. The caption under the picture read, "These are the Zionist Jewish leaders who are helping Jews escape to Israel." Needless to say, my father and the other two rabbis became an immediate target. For weeks, they hid in their homes until they were assured by the government that they would be secure and safe. Immediately, my father and another rabbi planned for the exit out of Lebanon. A special request by my father's cousins, who already lived in Mexico City after escaping Syria much earlier, was made to the government of Mexico to accept us as immigrants. Fortunately, it was approved after what seemed like an eternity, waiting for the news to arrive. Finally, like many other Sephardic Jewish families, we left Lebanon. We were able to immigrate to Mexico in 1971, leaving behind a life and history after thousands of years in that once beautiful and ancient region of the world that the Sephardim once called home. Thank you.